Hello, and welcome. Today, I'm going to whisper to you about a fascinating and captivating part of medieval history, the world of knights. This story is one of heroism, honor, loyalty, and epic battles fought on the fields of war. In medieval Europe, a knight was not just a warrior but also a protector of society, bound by a code of chivalry that emphasized bravery, justice, and noble service. We will journey together through the rise of knighthood, the intense training that shaped these warriors, and the ideals they strived to uphold in a time when war and peace were delicately intertwined. Let me guide you into this world of shining armor, gallant deeds, and unwavering loyalty as we unravel the legends and the realities of these iconic figures. So, find a comfortable place, relax, and let's dive into the medieval era where knights roamed the land, battling not only enemies but also their inner sense of duty and honor. The birth of knighthood, the rise of a class in the Middle Ages. So, imagine a time when Europe was filled with castles, kings, and endless wars. It was the Middle Ages, and this is where the knights first appeared, those brave warriors in shining armor that we all know from stories and legends. But the reality was much more complex, and the knights didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Their rise was deeply connected to the world of feudalism, where powerful lords needed loyal fighters to protect their lands. You see, back then, there were no standing armies like today. Kings and lords couldn't just call up soldiers whenever they needed them. Instead, they relied on personal agreements where men would pledge to fight in exchange for land or wealth. These men became known as knights, and they formed the backbone of medieval armies. They weren't just ordinary soldiers, though. They were elite warriors, trained to fight on horseback and master the use of swords, lances, and shields. Knights were more than just fighters. They were part of a bigger system of loyalty and duty. Every knight swore an oath of loyalty to a lord, promising to serve and protect in exchange for land and status. This was known as vassalage, and it was a crucial part of the feudal system. In this world, loyalty was everything. If a knight broke his oath or failed to protect his lord's land, it was seen as the ultimate betrayal. But how did someone actually become a knight? Well, it wasn't an easy journey. Most knights started training when they were very young, around 7 years old. These boys, often from noble families, would be sent to live in the household of another lord as pages. As pages, they learned how to behave in court, ride horses, and maybe even hold a sword. It was a bit like an internship for knights, except with way more discipline and physical training. By their teenage years, they moved up to become squires, where things got serious. As a squire, you served a knight directly, helping with his armor, weapons, and horses. And when your knight went into battle, you were right there beside him, learning the ropes of combat. Only after proving yourself on the battlefield could you finally become a knight in a formal ceremony. Imagine the pride and excitement of being dubbed a knight, often in a church with the blessing of a priest. It was a moment that marked the official start of your life as a warrior. Now, knights weren't just about fighting, they had a code of honor to live by. This was called chivalry, and it wasn't just about winning battles. Chivalry was about bravery, loyalty, and protecting the weak. Knights were expected to be noble not just in how they fought but also in how they lived. They were meant to defend the helpless, respect women, and serve their lords with absolute devotion. The church played a huge role in shaping this code, encouraging knights to fight for the right reasons, especially for religious causes like the Crusades. But, as with many ideals, reality didn't always match up. Not every knight lived up to the code of chivalry. Some were greedy, some were ruthless, and many fought more for personal gain than for noble causes. Still, the image of the knight as a perfect, honorable warrior persisted, thanks in large part to stories and songs that glorified their deeds. Chansons de geste, or songs of heroic deeds, and medieval romances told of legendary knights like King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, painting them as the ultimate heroes of their time. Over time, knighthood became something more than just a military role. By the 12th century, it was tied closely to nobility. Knights weren't just warriors, they were part of the ruling class. Sons of knights were expected to follow in their father's footsteps, and knighthood became a hereditary status. It was a way for families to maintain power and prestige, and for many young men, it offered a path to wealth and social standing. The church had a complicated relationship with knights. On one hand, it wanted to curb the violence, encouraging knights to fight only for just causes. On the other, the church needed knights to protect its own lands and wealth. Monasteries and churches often called on knights for protection against invaders, creating a symbiotic relationship. The church blessed the knights' battles, and in return, knights protected the church's interests. And while we often think of knighthood as a European phenomenon, it wasn't unique to the West. In Japan, the samurai followed a similar code of honor, known as Bushido, which emphasized loyalty, discipline, and martial skill. In the Middle East, the Mamluks were a class of warrior slaves who served Muslim rulers with remarkable discipline and strength, similar to the knights of Europe. So, knighthood wasn't just a European idea, it was part of a global tradition of warrior classes bound by codes of loyalty and honor. As the Middle Ages progressed, though, the role of knights began to change. With the invention of gunpowder and the rise of professional armies, the heavily armored knight became less effective on the battlefield. By the late medieval period, the golden age of knighthood was fading, but their legacy lived on in the stories and romantic ideals that still capture our imagination today. The birth of knighthood was the result of a chaotic and dangerous world, but it also gave rise to a class that shaped medieval society in profound ways. As we continue, we'll explore what it truly meant to be a knight, the training, the battles, and the ideals that defined their lives. The training of a knight, the making of an honorable warrior. Becoming a knight was no easy task. It wasn't just about wearing shining armor and riding into battle. It took years of dedication, discipline, and training to mold a young boy into a skilled and honorable knight. The process began at an early age, and it was a long journey filled with lessons in warfare, courtly manners, and the values that every knight was expected to uphold. It all started when a boy was around 7 or 8 years old. If he came from a noble family, he was likely sent away to another lord's castle to begin his training as a page. Now, being a page might sound glamorous, but it wasn't. In fact, it was a lot of hard work. As a page, you were responsible for serving the lord and lady of the household, attending to their needs, and learning the ins and outs of court life. It was here that young boys learned the basics of chivalry, respect, and loyalty. At this stage, the training was more about preparation than actual fighting. Pages were taught how to behave in the noble courts, how to be respectful, how to speak properly, and how to serve at banquets. But there were also physical lessons. Pages learned how to ride horses, an essential skill for any future knight, and they began their training with weapons, usually practicing with wooden swords and shields. It was like the early foundations of what would later become their expertise in battle. As pages grew older, typically by their early teens, they took on a new role, the squire. This was a huge step up in responsibility and skill. As a squire, you weren't just learning the basics anymore. Now, you were attached to a specific knight, serving as his personal assistant. You'd follow him everywhere, into battle, onto the training fields, even to tournaments. Your job was to care for his armor, keep his weapons in top shape, and tend to his horses. But more than just doing chores, squires were learning the art of war from the best source possible, a real, battle-hardened knight. During this time, the knight would teach his squire everything he knew about combat. Squires learned how to handle the knight's weapons, from the sword and shield to the lance and bow. They trained relentlessly, practicing their fighting skills day in and day out. They learned how to wear armor, no easy feat, as it could weigh up to 60 pounds, and how to fight while wearing it. The squire's training was intense, because when it came time for battle, a squire wasn't just an observer. He would ride into battle with his knight, helping him, protecting him, and sometimes even fighting alongside him. But being a knight wasn't just about fighting. Squires were also taught the principles of chivalry, the code of conduct that knights were expected to follow. They learned about honor, loyalty, and respect for their lords and ladies. They were taught to protect the weak, to show mercy to their enemies, and to be devout in their faith. These lessons were just as important as learning how to swing a sword, because without them, a knight was simply a fighter. With them, he became a true defender of his people and his faith. Once a squire had proven himself, both in training and in battle, he was ready to take the final step. The path to knighthood culminated in a dubbing ceremony, a highly symbolic event that often took place in a church or at a lord's castle. The night before the ceremony, the squire would spend hours in prayer, asking for God's blessing and guidance as he prepared for his new life as a knight. The next day, in the presence of lords, ladies, and sometimes even kings, the squire would kneel before his lord or a senior knight. A sword would be touched to his shoulders, and the Lord would say something like, "In the name of God, I dub thee knight. Be brave, be loyal, be true." It was a moment of immense pride, the culmination of years of training and hard work. From that point on, the young man would rise as a knight, fully accepted into the noble warrior class. But knighthood wasn't just an honor, it came with great responsibility. Newly dubbed knights were expected to serve their lords in battle, defend the weak, and uphold the chivalric code at all times. They were given land in exchange for their service, making them part of the feudal system, where loyalty and duty to their lords were paramount. And with this new status came the expectation to continue training and perfecting their skills. A knight never truly stopped learning. They were always refining their combat abilities, honing their strategies, and mastering the art of warfare. The journey from page to squire to knight wasn't easy, but it was a path that shaped the very character of medieval Europe. Knights were more than just warriors, they were the protectors of their people, the upholders of justice, and the defenders of their faith. Their training wasn't just about learning to fight, it was about learning to embody the ideals that made them noble. In this way, the training of a knight was about more than just physical strength and skill. It was about becoming a person of honor, someone who could be trusted to protect the land, serve their lord, and follow the code of chivalry. This balance between warrior and nobleman is what set knights apart from other soldiers of their time, and it's what made them the legendary figures that we still admire today. Honor and loyalty, the oath and values of knighthood. Knighthood wasn't just about battles and tournaments. In fact, the heart of being a knight revolved around a code of conduct, something that defined not just their actions on the battlefield, but every aspect of their lives. And at the center of this code were two essential values, honor and loyalty. These weren't just words, they were guiding principles that a knight had to live by, shaping how they behaved in society, how they treated others, and how they carried themselves throughout their entire lives. To start, let's talk about honor. For a knight, honor was everything. It was more valuable than gold, land, or even life itself. A knight's honor was his reputation, and losing it meant social ruin. In a world where your standing in the eyes of others determined your fate, honor was the foundation upon which a knight built his life. Honor wasn't just about how you acted in battle, it extended how you treated others, especially those weaker than yourself. Imagine a knight, clad in his shining armor, but not on the battlefield, rather, in the great hall of a lord's castle. His demeanor had to be as polished as his sword. A knight's honor was displayed not just in bravery but in how he respected the women, children, and elderly in his society. They were seen as the most vulnerable, and it was a knight's duty to protect them. If a knight dishonored himself by treating someone poorly, by acting cowardly, or by breaking a promise, his reputation could be ruined forever. Honor was a fragile thing, and knights knew that one wrong step could destroy everything they had worked for. But what about loyalty? Well, this was where a knight's commitment truly shone. When a young man was knighted, he didn't just take up arms, he swore an oath of loyalty to his lord. This wasn't a casual promise. It was a lifelong commitment, a bond that was as much about trust and responsibility as it was about military service. This oath, called fealty, meant that a knight was bound to his lord, not just in battle but in all aspects of life. The oath itself was a solemn and serious moment. Imagine the scene, a newly dubbed knight kneeling before his lord in a grand ceremony, with other noblemen watching. The knight would place his hands between the hands of his lord and swear his unwavering loyalty. In return, the lord would promise to protect the knight, providing land, wealth, and a place in the feudal system. This act wasn't just about the exchange of land for service. It was a sacred contract. Breaking it was the ultimate dishonor, often leading to severe consequences like losing your land, your title, or even your life. But this loyalty wasn't just to a single lord. A knight also had to swear loyalty to the church. You see, in medieval times, religion wasn't separate from daily life, it was intertwined with everything, especially knighthood. Knights weren't just fighting for their lords, they were fighting for God. Their loyalty to the church was reinforced by the idea of just war, the belief that some battles were morally justified because they defended the Christian faith. The Crusades are a perfect example of this. Thousands of knights left their homes, traveled great distances, and risked their lives in these religious wars, believing that they were serving a higher cause by protecting Christianity from its enemies. The church played a huge role in shaping what was expected of knights, adding a moral dimension to knighthood. Knights weren't just expected to be brave in battle, they had to be pious, merciful, and humble. Many knights were formally blessed by priests or bishops, often during the dubbing ceremony, giving their role a spiritual importance. It wasn't enough to be a strong warrior. A knight had to live by Christian virtues, always striving to act with justice and integrity. One key aspect of a knight's honor, especially when it came to loyalty, was how he treated his enemies. A true knight wasn't supposed to seek unnecessary bloodshed or cruelty. Instead, he was expected to show mercy to those he defeated. Offering a chance for surrender or showing restraint was considered an act of honor. Now, in the heat of battle, this wasn't always easy or even realistic, but it was an ideal that knights were encouraged to follow. Mercy showed that a knight wasn't just a brute but a man of noble character. Chivalry, the code that governed knights, was full of such ideals. It wasn't just about being good in combat, it was about embodying virtues like generosity, courtesy, and fairness. Knights were expected to be just as adept in the social world of the nobility as they were on the battlefield. This is where the concept of courtly love comes into play, a sort of romantic ideal where knights pledged themselves to the service of noble women. While this was often symbolic, it emphasized the knight's role as a protector and his duty to respect and honor women, especially those of higher status. Knights would compete in tournaments, perform heroic deeds, and engage in quests, all to win the favor of a lady and prove their worth. But loyalty didn't end with the Lord and the church. Knights were also expected to be loyal to each other and to the communities they served. This sense of brotherhood was especially strong among the knightly orders, like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller. These orders combined religious devotion with military duty, and the bonds of loyalty within them were unbreakable. The members of these orders fought side by side in the most dangerous battles, often putting their lives on the line for one another. Their loyalty wasn't just a duty, it was a way of life. Of course, not every knight lived up to these ideals. The reality of medieval life was harsh, and many knights were driven by greed, ambition, or personal gain rather than by honor or loyalty. Some knights broke their oaths, betrayed their lords, or abandoned their duties. Despite this, the ideal of the knight as a figure of honor and loyalty endured. This was largely thanks to medieval literature and legends. Think of stories like the Knights of the Round Table, where heroes like Sir Lancelot and King Arthur embodied the highest ideals of knighthood, bravery, honor, loyalty, and the defense of the weak. These stories helped to create and sustain the image of the knight as a noble figure, even when reality didn't always match up. In the end, a knight's honor and loyalty weren't just words or ceremonial gestures. They were deeply ingrained in the fabric of medieval society. A knight was expected to uphold these values in everything he did, from how he fought in battle to how he treated others in his daily life. It wasn't always easy, and not every knight was successful. The art of war, medieval combat tactics, and armor. When we think of knights, we almost always picture them charging into battle, fully armored, with swords glistening in the sunlight. But behind this iconic image lies a complex world of strategy and skill. Knights weren't simply men in armor, they were well-trained tacticians, experts in the art of warfare. They understood that brute strength wasn't enough to win battles. A combination of strategy, discipline, and preparation was essential. In the medieval era, knights often formed the backbone of a lord's army. Unlike modern professional armies, medieval forces consisted of a mix of knights, infantry, and archers, many of whom were called upon only in times of war. But the knights were the elite, the best trained and best equipped soldiers on the battlefield. Their role wasn't limited to fighting, they were leaders, inspiring both fear in their enemies and loyalty in their own troops. Let's begin by discussing the armor that knights wore, which is perhaps the most defining feature of a knight in battle. Over the centuries, armor evolved to meet the changing needs of combat. In the early Middle Ages, knights typically wore chainmail or a hauberk made up of interlocking metal rings. This flexible armor provided decent protection against slashing attacks but was less effective against blunt force or arrows. Weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms, around 45 to 65 pounds, it offered mobility but had its limitations. By the 14th and 15th centuries, plate armor became the standard. Large, solid metal plates protected the body from the increasingly powerful weapons of the time, like crossbows and longbows. A full suit of plate armor could weigh up to 50 kilograms, 110 pounds, but it was surprisingly maneuverable. Knights trained tirelessly to fight and move in this heavy armor, developing the strength and stamina required to remain effective in combat. Contrary to popular belief, knights in full armor could still ride, run, and even climb, though, of course, it took significant effort. Armor wasn't just about protection, it was also a sign of status and wealth. A knight's armor often reflected his social standing, with wealthier knights able to afford custom-made suits adorned with intricate designs, religious symbols, or family crests. These suits were both functional and decorative, projecting power and prestige on the battlefield. But armor alone couldn't win battles. Knights relied heavily on tactics to succeed in combat. One of the most iconic tactics was the cavalry charge. Knights mounted on powerful warhorses would form a tight formation and charge at full speed toward enemy lines, lances pointed forward. The force of this charge could break through enemy ranks, scattering infantry and causing panic. However, a successful charge required perfect timing and discipline. If launched too early or too late, the results could be catastrophic. Knights were also highly skilled in hand-to-hand combat. While the sword is the weapon most often associated with knights, it was far from the only tool in their arsenal. Knights were trained to use a variety of weapons depending on the situation. Lances were the weapon of choice during cavalry charges, designed to deliver a powerful blow at high speed. In close combat, knights used maces, warhammers, and battle axes, which were particularly effective against heavily armored opponents. These blunt weapons could crush bones and dent even the strongest armor. The sword, however, remained the most symbolic weapon of a knight. It wasn't just a tool for battle, it was a representation of the knight's honor, status, and family legacy. Swords were often passed down through generations, each carrying its own history. In battle, a knight's sword was his most trusted companion, perfectly balanced for slashing and thrusting. Shields were another crucial part of a knight's equipment, providing both protection and tactical advantages. Shields varied in size and design but were often large enough to deflect arrows and sword blows. Many knights had their shields emblazoned with family crests, further emphasizing their noble lineage and their right to defend their lords on the battlefield. Warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't just about individual skill, it was about strategy. Battles weren't chaotic clashes of steel, they were carefully orchestrated operations. Knights had to think like tacticians, assessing the terrain, the strength of their forces, and the weaknesses of their enemies. Commanders would often place knights on the flanks, where their mobility could be used to outmaneuver and surround enemy forces. Successful knights knew when to charge, when to retreat, and how to maintain morale among their troops. Siege warfare was another common aspect of medieval combat. Castles and fortified cities were the centerpieces of medieval defense, and besieging or defending these strongholds required immense endurance and strategy. Knights were often involved in these long, grueling campaigns. Siege engines like trebuchets, catapults, and battering rams were used to breach castle walls, while defenders relied on towers, walls, and moats to repel attacks. Sieges could last for months, turning warfare into a test of patience and ingenuity. Beyond the battlefield, knights also participated in tournaments, competitions that weren't just for entertainment but also served as training for war. These events allowed knights to sharpen their skills in a controlled environment. The joust was the most famous event, where two knights charged at each other with lances, attempting to unseat their opponent. But tournaments also included large-scale melee battles, where groups of knights fought in mock combat. These tournaments weren't just about showing off combat skills, they were opportunities for knights to win glory, prove their bravery, and gain the favor of lords and ladies. The life of a knight was one of discipline and constant preparation. From an early age, knights trained for the day when their skills would be tested in battle. Their ability to stay calm under pressure, to lead troops, and to follow orders made them invaluable on the battlefield. Whether charging into battle, defending a castle, or strategizing during a siege, knights were the cornerstone of medieval military power. In the end, knighthood wasn't just about combat, it was about mastering the art of war. Knights had to be physically strong, mentally sharp, and highly disciplined. They combined advanced weaponry with strategic thinking, making them some of the most formidable and respected warriors of the medieval era. Their legacy of skill, bravery, and leadership continues to captivate us today. Tournaments and mock battles, the prestige of knights. While knights are often associated with real battlefields, they also own their skills in a different arena, tournaments. These grand events were more than just entertainment, they were crucial in building a knight's prestige, reputation, and even his combat readiness. In a world where honor and fame were everything, tournaments provided knights with the perfect stage to showcase their abilities, win the favor of lords and ladies, and gain respect from their peers. Tournaments were organized by nobles, often to celebrate a special occasion like a royal wedding, the birth of an heir, or a successful military campaign. They were festive, elaborate affairs filled with feasting, music, and pageantry. But at the heart of every tournament were the mock battles that allowed knights to demonstrate their combat skills. These events mimicked the intensity of real battles, but in a controlled environment, providing knights with valuable training for the actual warfare they would inevitably face. One of the most iconic events in any tournament was the joust, where two knights, mounted on horseback, would charge at each other with lances, aiming to unseat their opponent. The joust was a test of both strength and precision, requiring the knight to strike his opponent with just the right amount of force at exactly the right moment. While jousts were usually fought with blunt lances to prevent fatal injuries, accidents did happen. A poorly aimed lance could shatter on impact, sending splinters flying or knocking a knight off his horse with dangerous force. Despite the risks, the joust remained one of the most prestigious events in any tournament, and winning a jousting match could elevate a knight's status considerably. In addition to jousting, tournaments also featured melee battles, where groups of knights engaged in mock combat. These melees could range from smaller skirmishes to large-scale battles involving dozens or even hundreds of knights, all fighting for glory. The melee was less structured than the joust, and it often mimicked the chaotic nature of actual battles. Knights would team up, form alliances, and fight in groups, using swords, maces, and shields to defeat their opponents. These battles were often brutal, and injuries were common. But for knights, the risk was worth it. Victory in a melee battle could bring great honor and fame. Tournaments were not just about fighting. They were also social and political events. Knights who performed well in tournaments could catch the eye of powerful lords and ladies, securing valuable patronage or even marriage alliances. Winning a tournament or excelling in combat was a way to enhance a knight's reputation, potentially leading to greater wealth, land, or military opportunities. Nobles would often sponsor knights in tournaments, and having a famous knight as an ally was a source of prestige for any lord. Beyond the glory and fame, tournaments served an important practical purpose. They were a form of military training, allowing knights to practice their combat skills in a controlled setting. The experience gained in tournaments helped knights prepare for real battles, where the stakes were far higher. A knight who excelled in the joust or melee could translate those skills to the battlefield, where his life, and the lives of his comrades, depended on his ability to fight effectively. Tournaments also reinforced the ideals of chivalry. They were seen as noble contests where knights could prove their honor, courage, and loyalty. Knights were expected to follow a code of conduct, treating their opponents with respect and avoiding dishonorable behavior. Cheating or acting dishonorably in a tournament could ruin a knight's reputation, while fair play and bravery earned admiration. The tournament, in this sense, was as much about moral character as it was about physical skill. For the spectators, especially the noble ladies, tournaments were an opportunity to witness acts of bravery and skill. Knights often dedicated their performances to these ladies, wearing tokens of affection, such as scarves or ribbons, given to them by their chosen noblewoman. This practice of courtly love added a romantic dimension to the tournaments, where knights were not just fighting for victory, but also for the honor of the ladies they admired. Though tournaments were often festive occasions, they also carried significant political weight. Kings and nobles would host these events as a way to assert their power, demonstrate wealth, and bring together the military elite of the realm. Tournaments provided a platform for alliances to be made, loyalties to be confirmed, and rivalries to play out in a relatively controlled setting. The political maneuvering that happened behind the scenes was just as important as the events happening on the tournament field. As time passed, the tournament culture evolved. In earlier centuries, the melee and joust were serious tests of skill with real risks. But by the late Middle Ages, as warfare began to change with the rise of gunpowder and professional standing armies, tournaments became less about training for war and more about spectacle. The armor worn by knights in these later tournaments became more decorative, designed to impress spectators rather than withstand the rigors of battle. Tournaments became more of a social event than a military exercise, with knights competing for prestige rather than preparing for war. Even so, the legacy of tournaments endured. They helped solidify the knightly class's place in society, reinforcing the ideals of chivalry, honor, and martial prowess. Tournaments provided knights with a stage to demonstrate their skills, prove their loyalty, and win fame in a way that went beyond the battlefield. And while the violence was simulated, the prestige gained from performing well in a tournament was very real. In the end, tournaments were not just about fighting, they were about showing the world what it meant to be a knight. They combined the physical demands of combat with the social and moral expectations of chivalry, offering knights a way to achieve glory, fame, and honor. Whether through the clash of lances in the joust or the chaos of the melee, tournaments allowed knights to live out the ideals of their profession in front of an eager audience. The Crusades, the sacred duties of knights. In the Middle Ages, the life of a knight wasn't just confined to battles between rival lords or defending castles in their homeland. One of the most significant and defining experiences for many knights was participating in the Crusades, a series of religious wars that spanned several centuries. These campaigns were seen as holy missions, where knights believed they were fighting not just for their lords, but for their faith, in the name of Christianity. The Crusades began in 1095 when Pope Urban II called upon Christian knights across Europe to take up arms and journey to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. This call to arms wasn't just a military mission, it was framed as a spiritual obligation. Knights were told that by participating in the Crusades, they could earn forgiveness for their sins, ensure their place in heaven, and protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. For many, this was a compelling and irresistible call. The First Crusade saw thousands of knights, along with their retinues and other soldiers, marching across Europe toward the Middle East. These knights were not only motivated by religious fervor but also by the promise of adventure, wealth, and the potential for acquiring new lands. The prospect of carving out a new life in distant lands was tempting for younger sons of nobility who stood to inherit little from their families back home. Once in the Holy Land, knights encountered a world vastly different from their own. The terrain, climate, and even the tactics of their enemies required them to adapt quickly. Muslim forces, particularly those under skilled leaders like Saladin, posed a formidable challenge. These forces were often more mobile and tactically flexible than the European knights, who relied heavily on traditional heavy cavalry charges. The Crusades turned into long, grueling campaigns, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But the Crusades were about more than just military conquest, they were about religion. Knights saw themselves as defenders of the faith, protectors of Christianity in a hostile world. The Church played a massive role in encouraging and supporting the Crusades, portraying the wars as just and holy. Many knights carried the cross on their shields and banners, a symbol of their divine mission. They fought not only to reclaim land but to spread Christian values and protect Christian pilgrims who sought to visit holy sites. The Crusades also gave rise to powerful knightly orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These military religious orders were established to protect Christian pilgrims and defend the newly established Crusader states in the Holy Land. The Knights Templar, in particular, became one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, not only for their military prowess but also for their extensive wealth and political influence. These knights were bound by strict codes of conduct, combining the life of a monk with that of a warrior. For many knights, participation in the Crusades was a deeply spiritual experience. They believed that they were fighting a righteous battle, a cosmic struggle between Christianity and Islam. Knights viewed themselves as part of a larger divine plan, where their actions on the battlefield were part of God's will. This sense of religious duty gave the Crusades an emotional intensity that went beyond normal warfare. The promise of spiritual reward, whether it was absolution from sin or eternal salvation, gave knights the conviction to fight on even in the face of overwhelming odds. However, the reality of the Crusades was far from the idealized vision of holy war that many knights had been led to believe. The Crusades were often brutal and violent, with both Christian and Muslim forces committing atrocities. Cities were sacked, populations slaughtered, and entire regions devastated by the conflict. The sheer violence of the Crusades left a lasting legacy of bitterness and mistrust between the Christian and Muslim worlds. Despite these grim realities, the Crusades remained a powerful force in the medieval mindset. Knights who returned from the Crusades were often treated as heroes, their status elevated by the fact that they had fought in a holy war. Many knights brought back stories of their adventures, as well as treasures and relics from the East. These experiences shaped the identity of medieval knighthood, reinforcing the idea that knights were not just warriors but also defenders of the Christian faith. The Crusades had a lasting impact on European society, both in terms of religion and warfare. They changed the way knights viewed themselves and their place in the world. While the Crusades ultimately failed to maintain lasting Christian control over the Holy Land, they left a profound legacy in European culture, one that shaped the course of medieval history. For knights, the Crusades were more than just battles, they were holy quests, undertaken in the service of both God and King. It was this fusion of spiritual duty and military prowess that defined the role of knights during this period, making them both feared and revered throughout the medieval world. Women knights, legends and realities. When we think of knights, the image that usually comes to mind is that of a heavily armored man, galloping into battle, sword raised high. However, history and legend both hint at the existence of women warriors, some of whom took on the mantle of knighthood, defying the expectations of medieval society. While the concept of female knights may seem rare or even mythical, there were indeed women who fought, commanded armies, and embodied the ideals of knighthood. This chapter explores the legends and realities of these remarkable women. Medieval society was overwhelmingly patriarchal, with clear distinctions between the roles of men and women. Women were typically expected to manage households, raise children, and support their husbands in their roles as knights or lords. However, history is full of women who stepped outside these traditional roles, especially in times of war. Noblewomen, in particular, sometimes found themselves in positions of power, either defending their lands while their husbands were away or leading troops in battle. One of the most famous examples of a female warrior, though not officially dubbed a knight, is Joan of Arc. Born in the early 15th century, Joan believed she was chosen by God to lead France to victory against the English during the 100 Years' War. At the age of 17, she convinced the future King of France, Charles VII, to allow her to lead an army. Clad in armor and carrying a banner, Joan led French forces to several important victories, including the Siege of Orleans. Though she wasn't a knight in the traditional sense, Joan embodied the ideals of chivalry, bravery, piety, and loyalty to her country. Her story, though tragic, she was captured by the English and burned at the stake for heresy, remains one of the most enduring tales of female heroism in history. Beyond Joan of Arc, there are other notable examples of women who either fought alongside men or took up arms in defense of their homes and lands. In the 12th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, accompanied her husband, King Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade. Although she didn't engage in direct combat, Eleanor's presence on the crusade, alongside other noblewomen, showed that women could play an important role in military campaigns, even if they were not on the front lines. Eleanor later became Queen of England and was the mother of Richard the Lionheart, one of England's most famous crusading kings. While women like Joan of Arc and Eleanor of Aquitaine were exceptions in a male-dominated world, they weren't the only women to take up arms. The Order of the Hatchet was a military order founded in the 12th century in the town of Tortosa, Spain, specifically to honor a group of women who had defended their town from a Moorish attack. These women were knighted for their bravery, granted privileges normally reserved for male knights, such as tax exemptions and the right to use weapons. The Order of the Hatchet, while short-lived, is a fascinating example of how women could be recognized for their martial contributions. Moreover, during times of political instability or in the absence of male leadership, women occasionally took on roles that would have been reserved for knights. Matilda of Tuscany, an 11th century noblewoman, was a key player in the power struggles between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Known as one of the greatest military leaders of her time, Matilda led armies into battle and defended her lands with the strategic mind of a seasoned general. Her political influence and military prowess made her one of the most formidable figures of her era. Though it was rare for women to be formally knighted, the concept of chivalry and the ideals it promoted, bravery, loyalty, and honor, weren't exclusive to men. In literature, female knights often appear as figures of great strength and virtue. The Arthurian legends, for example, feature characters like Bradamante, a fearless woman warrior who fights alongside men, and Britomart, the knightly heroine of Edmund Spenser's epic poem The Faerie Queene. These literary figures, though fictional, reflect the fascination with the idea of women who could match men in both skill and honor. Another fascinating example comes from the Crusader kingdoms in the Middle East. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established by European crusaders, saw women like Melisende, Queen of Jerusalem, take on military and political leadership roles. Melisende ruled as a co-sovereign with her husband and later her son, and she actively defended her kingdom from both internal rebellion and external threats. While she may not have ridden into battle as a knight, she commanded armies and shaped the course of Crusader history. The existence of female knights or warriors challenges the traditional narratives of medieval knighthood, suggesting that even in an era that placed strict limits on women's roles, there were still spaces, often created by war, political turmoil, or exceptional circumstances, where women could emerge as leaders and fighters. In some cases, women didn't just adopt the martial role, they were honored for it. The legend of women knights continues to inspire. In modern times, figures like Joan of Arc have become symbols of strength, resilience, and defiance against oppression. Her canonization as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1920 further cemented her status as an iconic female figure, one who defied the norms of her time to follow her divine mission. The role of women in medieval warfare wasn't always as visible or celebrated as that of their male counterparts, but their contributions were significant nonetheless. Whether defending their lands, leading armies, or inspiring legends, these women demonstrated that the ideals of knighthood, honor, courage, and loyalty were not confined to men alone. They defied the expectations of their time, and while their stories may be fewer in number, their impact is no less profound. In exploring these women, both real and fictional, we see that knighthood, as a concept, could transcend gender. Though the formal structures of knighthood were built around male warriors, the spirit of chivalry was one that courageous women could, and did, embody. Knightly orders, the Templars and Hospitallers. In the medieval world, knights didn't only fight as individual warriors. Some of the most famous and influential knights were part of powerful military religious orders. Two of the most well-known of these were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, whose missions and influence extended beyond the battlefield, blending faith and warfare in a way that would leave a lasting impact on history. The Knights Templar were founded in the early 12th century, shortly after the First Crusade. Their original purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, where roads were often dangerous and fraught with bandits and enemy forces. Starting as a small group of knights, led by Stepanians, they soon gained recognition and support from the Church. By 1129, the Templars had the backing of religious leaders like Bernard of Clairvaux, and their order began to grow both in size and influence. The Templars adopted a distinctive uniform, a white mantle adorned with a red cross, which became a symbol of their holy mission. The Templars weren't just defenders of pilgrims, they became one of the most powerful military forces in the Crusades. Their strict discipline, rigorous training, and strong sense of purpose made them a fearsome presence on the battlefield. Known for their bravery and willingness to charge headlong into danger, the Templars played a critical role in several key battles during the Crusades. They were often positioned at the forefront of attacks, using their heavily armored knights to break through enemy lines. Their reputation for fearlessness in the face of overwhelming odds was solidified, and they quickly earned respect and fear from both their allies and their enemies. As the Templars gained fame for their military prowess, they also became one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. Through land donations, financial expertise, and their role in protecting and supporting Crusader states, the Templars amassed vast wealth. They created one of the earliest forms of banking, allowing Crusaders and pilgrims to deposit money in one location and withdraw it in another, providing safety for their assets during long journeys. This financial power helped fund their military campaigns, but it also made the Templars targets of envy and suspicion. Their immense wealth and influence would eventually lead to their downfall. By the early 14th century, the political landscape in Europe had shifted. The Crusades had largely failed, and the Templars' resources and independence made them a threat to certain rulers. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, orchestrated their arrest, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and other serious crimes. Under torture, many Templars confessed to these charges, leading to the dissolution of the order by Pope Clement V in 1312. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, and the Templar order was disbanded. Despite their tragic end, the Templars left a lasting legacy, with their name becoming synonymous with mystery, conspiracy theories, and intrigue even centuries later. While the Templars were gaining power, another military order was rising, the Knights Hospitaller. Unlike the Templars, whose mission was primarily military from the start, the Hospitallers began as a charitable organization. Founded to care for sick and injured pilgrims in Jerusalem, the Hospitallers operated hospitals and provided care to those in need. Over time, as the conflicts in the Holy Land intensified, the Hospitallers took on a military role, defending Christian territories and pilgrims from Muslim forces. Like the Templars, the Hospitallers were known for their discipline and dedication, both on and off the battlefield. They wore black mantles adorned with a white cross, symbolizing their dual role as warriors and caregivers. The Hospitallers became famous for their defense of key Crusader fortresses, most notably Croix de Chevaliers, a massive and seemingly impenetrable castle that remains a symbol of Crusader strength to this day. The Hospitallers fought bravely in many battles during the Crusades, often taking on dangerous missions to protect Christian holdings. After the fall of the last Crusader states in the Holy Land, the Hospitallers, unlike the Templars, managed to adapt to the changing political situation. They moved their base of operations first to the island of Rhodes and later to Malta, where they became known as the Knights of Malta. From these islands, they continued their fight against Muslim forces, particularly the Ottoman Empire, for centuries. One of their most famous victories came in 1565, during the Great Siege of Malta, when the vastly outnumbered Hospitallers successfully defended the island from a massive Ottoman invasion force. This victory solidified the Hospitallers' reputation as elite warriors and ensured their place in history as one of the most resilient military orders of the medieval world. Both the Templars and the Hospitallers represent the dual nature of medieval knighthood, part warrior, part monk. They lived under religious vows, serving both God and the Church, but they were also fierce soldiers, trained in the art of war and dedicated to defending Christendom. While the Templars met a tragic end, the Hospitallers adapted and continued their mission of both charity and defense for centuries. The impact of these knightly orders on medieval society was profound. Their military strength, combined with their religious devotion, made them central figures in the Crusades. Their influence extended beyond the battlefield, as they became involved in politics, economics, and the shaping of medieval European society. The Templars, with their innovative financial systems, influenced the development of early banking in Europe, while the Hospitallers' charitable work left a lasting legacy in the medical field. Even today, the legacy of these knightly orders continues to inspire fascination. The Hospitallers, now known as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, still exist, carrying out charitable work around the world. The Templars, though long disbanded, remain shrouded in mystery, with their story continuing to captivate the imaginations of writers, filmmakers, and historians alike. The enduring legend of the Templars and Hospitallers serves as a reminder of the powerful blend of faith, warfare, and honor that define these remarkable knights. The decline of chivalry, the changing role of knights in a modernizing world. As the medieval period drew to a close, the world of the knight, once the epitome of military and social power, began to change dramatically. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the role of knights, and the very idea of chivalry, was challenged by a rapidly shifting political and technological landscape. The chivalric ideals that had guided knights for centuries were still honored in literature and courtly life, but on the battlefield, new forces were beginning to reshape the way wars were fought and societies were governed. One of the key reasons for the decline of the knight's prominence was the advent of gunpowder and firearms. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, particularly cannons and muskets, revolutionized warfare. No longer was the heavily armored knight on horseback the most dominant force on the battlefield. Armor, which had once protected knights from arrows and swords, became far less effective against bullets and artillery. This shift meant that the traditional cavalry charge, which had been a staple of medieval warfare, became less and less useful as firearms became more prevalent. In the face of these new weapons, knights found themselves increasingly vulnerable, and the balance of power on the battlefield began to tilt towards infantry armed with guns and cannons. In addition to technological advancements, the rise of professional standing armies further diminished the importance of knights. During the Middle Ages, lords relied on their vassal knights to provide military service in exchange for land and protection. But by the late medieval period, kings and other rulers began to raise professional armies, paid soldiers who were often better trained and equipped than the feudal levies. These professional armies could be called upon at any time, unlike knights, who were typically bound by seasonal or short-term service. The reliance on professional soldiers allowed rulers to wage wars more effectively and for longer periods, reducing their dependence on the traditional knightly class. The changing structure of society also played a role in the decline of knighthood. As feudalism began to weaken and centralized monarchies grew stronger, the influence of local lords, and by extension, their knights, began to wane. In many kingdoms, the power of the nobility was increasingly overshadowed by the authority of the king, who controlled the centralized government and military forces. The rise of cities and commerce also contributed to this shift. Wealth was no longer solely based on land ownership, as merchants, bankers, and other professionals began to rise in prominence. This economic transformation meant that knights, who had traditionally been tied to the land and the feudal system, were no longer the dominant social and economic force they once were. Despite these changes, the ideals of chivalry continued to hold sway in many aspects of noble life, even as the practical role of knights diminished. Literature, such as the romantic tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, kept the image of the noble, honorable knight alive. These stories celebrated the virtues of courage, loyalty, and honor, qualities that knights were expected to embody, even if their military significance was fading. In the courts of Europe, knights continued to participate in tournaments and other displays of martial skill, where they could showcase their prowess and live up to the chivalric code, even if these events had become more symbolic than practical. By the late 15th century, orders of knighthood began to shift their focus from military service to matters of prestige and honor. In many cases, knighthood became a purely ceremonial title, bestowed upon noblemen as a mark of distinction rather than a call to arms. Rulers, particularly in France and England, began to establish chivalric orders like the Order of the Garter or the Order of the Golden Fleece, which honored knights not for their battlefield achievements, but for their loyalty and service to the crown. These orders emphasized courtly behavior, diplomacy, and loyalty to the monarch, signaling the transformation of knighthood from a military to a more symbolic role. One of the most dramatic examples of the knight's declining role in warfare came during the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, a pivotal moment in the 100 Years' War between England and France. The heavily armored French knights, who were expected to dominate the battlefield, were decisively defeated by English archers armed with longbows. The battle highlighted how outdated the traditional tactics of knights had become in the face of new military technologies and strategies. It also marked a turning point in the perception of knights as the dominant force in European warfare. The transformation of knighthood didn't happen overnight, and many knights continued to play important roles in the military campaigns of the late medieval period. However, by the time the Renaissance fully took hold in Europe, the world had moved on. The rise of gunpowder armies, professional soldiers, and centralized monarchies had relegated knights to the margins of military life. What had once been the highest honor for a warrior now became a nostalgic symbol of a bygone era. Still, the legacy of knighthood lived on in the culture and traditions of Europe. The values of chivalry, honor, loyalty, courage remained deeply ingrained in the aristocracy, and even today, modern orders of knighthood continue to exist, often as honorary titles recognizing individuals for their service to society. The decline of the knight as a military force may have been inevitable, but the ideals they represented have endured, leaving a lasting imprint on European history and culture. The legacy of knighthood, modern orders and symbols of honor. As the medieval knight faded from the battlefield, the legacy of knighthood evolved into something far more symbolic, yet still powerful. The values of honor, loyalty, and service, once embodied by knights in shining armor, found new expressions in the form of modern orders of knighthood and honorary titles, which have continued to play a significant role in European society and beyond. Today, knighthood represents a lasting symbol of respect and recognition, not for martial prowess, but for contributions to society, culture, and the betterment of humanity. The transition from medieval knighthood to modern orders began as early as the late Middle Ages, when rulers started creating chivalric orders that focused more on prestige and honor than military service. One of the earliest examples is the Order of the Garter, founded by King Edward III of England in 1348. The Order of the Garter was, and still is, one of the highest honors that can be bestowed upon a person in England. Knights of the Garter, although no longer expected to fight, were chosen for their loyalty to the crown and their service to the kingdom. The famous motto of the order, Honi soit cum mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, reflects the chivalric values of honor and integrity that the order seeks to uphold. Similarly, in Burgundy, the Order of the Golden Fleece was established in 1430 by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, as a prestigious knighthood that emphasized the ideals of loyalty and chivalry. While the Golden Fleece also began as a military honor, it quickly evolved into a ceremonial order, rewarding those who demonstrated loyalty to the Burgundian court and, later, to the Habsburg rulers of Spain and Austria. Like the Order of the Garter, the Golden Fleece continues to exist today as a symbol of noble heritage and honor. As the centuries passed, many other nations followed suit, creating their own honorary orders of knighthood. These titles were often reserved for the nobility or the elite, but they gradually expanded to include individuals from all walks of life who had made significant contributions to society. In France, the Legion of Honor was established by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1802 as a way to recognize both military and civilian achievements. Today, the Legion of Honor remains France's highest order of merit, awarded to those who have distinguished themselves in fields ranging from arts and sciences to public service. The evolution of knighthood didn't stop with Europe. Many modern nations, particularly those with connections to the British Commonwealth, maintain systems of knighthood as part of their own honors tradition. In the United Kingdom, the tradition of conferring knighthood upon individuals for exceptional service to the nation continues to this day. Modern knights and dames are often celebrated figures in the arts, sciences, politics, and charitable work. Figures like Sir Winston Churchill, Sir Paul McCartney, and Dame Judi Dench are just a few examples of individuals who have been knighted in recognition of their contributions to British society and culture. Unlike their medieval counterparts, these modern knights do not don armor or wield swords in battle, but they embody the same values of service, honor, and dedication that defined knighthood centuries ago. Beyond formal knighthoods, the legacy of chivalry and knightly values remains deeply embedded in Western culture. The code of chivalry, which once governed the conduct of knights in battle and in courtly life, has transcended its original context to influence modern notions of ethics, morality, and leadership. The idea of acting with honor, showing loyalty, and protecting the vulnerable are all concepts rooted in the chivalric tradition that continue to resonate in various aspects of contemporary life. These values are not limited to knights, but have become part of the broader cultural ideal of what it means to be a noble and just person. Moreover, the image of the knight has become a powerful symbol in literature, film, and popular culture. Tales of noble knights, such as the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, have been retold countless times over the centuries, continuing to capture the imagination of people around the world. Whether it's the bravery of Sir Lancelot, the wisdom of King Arthur, or the chivalric quest of the Grail, these stories have embedded the knightly figure as a timeless archetype of courage, honor, and moral integrity. The knightly archetype also appears in modern storytelling, from the superheroes in comic books to the noble warriors in fantasy literature. Characters like Batman, who upholds a strict moral code, or Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings, who embodies the ideals of leadership and sacrifice, are clear echoes of the chivalric traditions that shaped the knights of the Middle Ages. Even in contemporary settings, the knightly values of protecting the innocent, standing for justice, and adhering to a code of conduct remain compelling narratives. While the practical role of knights in warfare may have faded centuries ago, the symbolic power of knighthood and its associated values continues to thrive in modern society. Whether through honorary titles, cultural symbols, or ethical ideals, knighthood has transcended its origins to become a lasting emblem of honor, service, and dedication to a greater cause. As we look back on the history of knighthood, it's clear that the legacy of knights is not limited to the battles they fought or the castles they defended. Instead, their true legacy lies in the enduring values they represented, values that continue to inspire people to strive for greatness, act with honor, and serve their communities with courage and humility. As we conclude our exploration of knighthood, we see that the journey of knights has been one of transformation, starting as warriors bound by honor and loyalty, evolving through the ages into symbols of integrity, service, and heroism. From the medieval battlefields to the modern halls of honor, the legacy of knighthood has left a profound mark on history, shaping our ideas of what it means to serve, protect, and lead. Whether they were defending the walls of castles, embarking on holy crusades, or inspiring the values we still hold dear today, knights remain iconic figures whose impact can be felt even now. Their legacy teaches us that honor, courage, and loyalty transcend time and remain as important today as they were centuries ago. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of knights, chivalry, and the enduring symbols of honor that they represent. Until next time, may the values of knighthood continue to inspire and guide us in all that we do.